My husband introduced me to his colleagues as his eternally unemployed wife the night I decided to end his career. He didn't know I owned the company that signed his paychecks. He didn't know I had been signing those paychecks for 9 years. And he certainly didn't know that the woman he'd spent 3 years mocking was about to walk into that boardroom as the majority shareholder who could dismantle everything he'd built on top of my foundation. I stood at the kitchen island that Tuesday evening, cutting vegetables I didn't need to cut, listening to my husband laugh with 4 of his colleagues in our dining room. They'd come straight from the office to our house, my house, though my husband had long since stopped remembering that, already loosened by happy hour drinks, already loud in the way men get when they believe they're untouchable. "You have to understand, Claire," my husband said, his voice carrying that particular warmth he reserved for audiences. "She's been figuring herself out since I met her. 40 years old and still searching." He chuckled. His colleagues chuckled. "I keep telling her, babe, just pick something. Anything." Someone said, "At least she married well." More laughter. I set down the knife and took a slow sip of water. The patience I'd developed over 3 years of this wasn't weakness. I want to be very clear about that, because every person who hears this story eventually asks the same question. Why did you wait? The answer is simple. I wasn't waiting because I was afraid. I was waiting because I wanted them to confess. Not just to be fired. Anyone can be fired and land somewhere else with a different title and the same rotten habits. I wanted federal charges. I wanted the kind of documented misconduct that follows a person through every background check for the rest of their professional life. I wanted to make it impossible for them to hurt anyone else the way they'd hurt the people I'd watched them grind down for years. That takes time to build. I'd started building it 18 months ago. Let me go back to the beginning. I built Hartwell Distribution Group over a decade, before I ever met my husband. I was 29, running a small pharmaceutical logistics consultancy that I'd funded entirely on my own after watching my mother's medical supply business get swallowed by a larger competitor during a predatory acquisition. I understood distribution, I understood pharmaceutical supply chains, and I understood exactly how vulnerable mid-size companies were when they didn't have the capital to protect themselves. So I built one that did. By the time I was 35, Hartwell was a parent company with 3 subsidiaries. My name didn't appear on any public-facing documents, a deliberate choice I'd made after an early investor attempted to use my personal reputation to leverage his own deals. I worked through a network of holding companies and legal structures that kept my identity at arm's length from the brand. Only my executive team and legal counsel knew who the majority shareholder actually was. To the outside world, Hartwell's founder was a reclusive private investor who communicated through representatives. That was the version of myself that existed when I met my husband at a fundraiser for a children's hospital. He was handsome and charismatic, and worked in pharmaceutical distribution sales, which, I told myself later, I should have recognized as a cosmic joke. He was mid-level then, ambitious but not yet arrogant, the kind of man who asks questions and actually listens to the answers. I'd been hurt enough times to be careful. A former boyfriend had used my connections to launch his own venture without telling me. Before that, a man I'd loved genuinely had seen my success and decided his primary role in our relationship was to manage my money and my image. I'd learned, at significant personal cost, that my wealth had a way of changing people. So when I met my husband, I made a quiet decision. I wanted to see who he was before he knew what I had. I drove a modest sedan. I wore inexpensive clothes to casual events. When he asked what I did for work, I told him I consulted occasionally but was taking time off to figure out my next chapter. He seemed unfazed. He seemed warm. For 2 years of dating and 1 year of marriage, he was the man I thought I was marrying. Then Hartwell acquired his employer. My husband worked for a regional pharmaceutical distributor called Meridian Sales Group. They had decent revenue and a serious structural problem. Their senior sales team had been running an informal kickback arrangement with hospital procurement managers for years, nothing sophisticated, just preferential contracts in exchange for personal payments routed through fake consulting invoices. It was the kind of corruption that everyone in a company eventually knows about and no one says anything because the money is good and the culture rewards silence. I learned about it during our due diligence process. I didn't know, at that point, that my husband was involved. I found out 8 months after the acquisition closed, when my compliance director flagged a pattern of irregular payments tied to his regional account portfolio. I remember sitting in my home office, the locked study my husband had always assumed was just where I journaled or whatever, staring at those preliminary reports. The amount wasn't catastrophic, the moral reality of it was. I called Monica, my most trusted executive and the only person outside of legal who knew my actual identity. "How deep does it go?" I asked. "We're still mapping it," she said. "But Nathan's name appears in 4 of the flagged transaction chains. He may not be the architect, but he knew." I closed my eyes. The smart move, the clean move, would have been to begin immediate termination proceedings and separate my personal life from the professional problem. But something Monica said stopped me. 4 transactions. If we moved now, we'd get 4. If we waited and watched, we'd understand the entire network. We might get all of them, and we might get enough to refer to federal prosecutors instead of simply handing out severance agreements that amounted to quiet permission to take the scheme somewhere else. "How long do you need?" I asked. "Give me a year," Monica said. "Maybe 18 months. Do it quietly," I said. "Don't move anything until I say so." That was the beginning of the 18 months. And that was the beginning of my husband's assumption that my patience was weakness. I won't pretend it was easy. I sat through dinner parties where he told people I had never really found my footing. I watched him accept a VP promotion, a promotion his team's inflated sales numbers had made possible, sales numbers that looked impressive because his team was paying for preferential contract placement, and I attended the celebration dinner he threw for himself and smiled while his colleagues toasted to his relentless drive. I went to his mother's house for Christmas and listened to her suggest, gently, that perhaps I should look into taking some courses. The documentation grew. Monica's team was meticulous. By the time 16 months had passed, we had transaction records, email chains, 2 whistleblower testimonies from procurement managers who'd grown uncomfortable with the arrangement, and a forensic accounting analysis that traced nearly $400,000 in irregular payments across an 18-month period. I sent everything to our legal team and asked a single question: is this enough for a federal referral? The answer was yes. The Tuesday of the dinner party was the night I confirmed the date. I went upstairs early, leaving my husband to his colleagues and their noise. I locked the study door and opened my laptop. Monica's message was already waiting: board meeting confirmed. Thursday, federal referral documents ready for your signature. The Meridian compliance audit will be presented as a routine post-acquisition review. I wrote back, put me on the attendee list. Not as a board member. As a consultant brought in to review findings. I want to be in the room before they know who I am. She replied within minutes, "Are you sure? That's not necessary. You could do this remotely." I stared at the screen. Through the floor, I could hear my husband laughing at something one of his colleagues had said. "I'm sure," I typed back. 2 days later, I arrived at Hartwell's corporate headquarters at 7 in the morning. The building was one I'd selected and leased 12 years ago, in a different city than where my husband and I lived, which was the small geographic detail that had always kept my 2 worlds cleanly separated. The security team at the front desk knew me on sight. The executive floor recognized my footsteps. Monica met me in my private office with coffee and the full briefing package. "They've requested an extension on the compliance review presentation," she told me. "Their legal team wants more time." "They don't get more time," I said. "The meeting proceeds as scheduled." She nodded. "Nathan's team is already in the building. They arrived for a pre-meeting about the quarterly numbers. They have no idea the compliance presentation is on the agenda." I spent the next 2 hours reviewing everything one final time. The evidence was exactly what I'd hoped it would be: systematic, documented, irrefutable. At 9:15, Monica handed me a visitor badge with a name I didn't recognize. A cover identity, clean and simple. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for a year and a half," I said. The conference room where my husband and his team were gathered was on the 8th floor. I took a different elevator and walked through a connecting corridor, arriving at the glass-walled observation area adjacent to the room. Through the glass, I could see them clearly. My husband sat at one end of the table looking confident, relaxed. He had a way of occupying physical space like he owned it, a habit I'd once found attractive and had spent 3 years watching curdle into something uglier. His regional director sat to his left, scrolling through his phone. 3 other members of his team completed the group. They were reviewing their quarterly presentation, laughing at something the regional director had said. The body language of people who expected today to be routine. I watched my husband lean back in his chair and say something to the room. His colleagues responded with the easy laughter of men who've been performing for each other long enough that the performance has become genuine. I thought about the dinner 2 nights ago. I thought about his mother's Christmas suggestion that I take some courses. I turned away and walked to the room where the board was already assembled. I had not told the board the full extent of what was about to unfold. They knew there was a compliance issue requiring urgent attention. They did not yet know that the VP of Sales scheduled to present his quarterly numbers in an hour was one of the central figures in the fraud investigation, or that the majority shareholder they communicated with exclusively through encrypted correspondence was going to be sitting in the room. I introduced myself to the assembled group as a consultant retained by Hartwell's legal team. The board members were polite, professional, appropriately attentive. 2 of them had been with the company since before the acquisition and recognized my name from previous correspondence, though they'd never seen my face. Monica began the presentation. The compliance audit came first: standard formatting, careful language, the kind of presentation that starts with context before it arrives at conclusions. I watched the board members' expressions shift as the numbers appeared on screen. One of the senior directors began making notes. Another quietly set down his coffee. By the time Monica reached the transaction analysis, the room had the particular quality of silence that falls over people who understand they are witnessing something significant. "We're recommending immediate suspension of the implicated personnel pending a federal referral," Monica said. "Our legal team has been in contact with the relevant federal office. They've indicated sufficient grounds to proceed." The board chair, a careful, measured man named Gerald who had been with the company for 6 years, looked up from his documents. "This implicates current Meridian leadership?" "The VP of Sales and 4 members of his regional team," Monica confirmed. Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Does the VP know this meeting is on the agenda today?" "No," I said. Everyone at the table looked at me. I let the silence hold for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said, "He thinks he's here to present quarterly numbers. I'd like to keep it that way until he walks into this room." Gerald studied me with the careful assessment of someone recalibrating. "And you are?" "I'm the person who built this company," I said simply. "My name is Claire Hartwell." The reaction was not loud. It rarely is when something fundamental shifts. Gerald set down his pen. The 2 directors who'd recognized my name exchanged a look. The room absorbed the information with the quiet focus of people who are very good at their jobs. "I've communicated through representatives for 12 years, I continued. "Today I wanted to be here in person. Because the man walking through that door in 40 minutes is my husband. And I wanted to look him in the eye when he understands what he's done." Gerald asked 3 precise questions. I answered all 3. He nodded once, with the slow deliberateness of a man who has made consequential decisions before and knows how they feel. "We proceed as planned," he said. At 10 o'clock, my husband and his team were escorted to the boardroom. I was seated at the far end of the table, positioned where the lighting was good and I could see the door clearly. Monica stood near the presentation screen. The board members were in their places. Federal compliance documents were stacked neatly to one side. My husband walked in with the easy confidence of a man who has been winning his whole life. He nodded to Gerald. He took his seat, opened his presentation folder, and began to set up his slides. He did not look at me immediately. There were other people in the room and I was at the far end and he was focused on his setup. Then he looked up. I watched the moment his brain processed what his eyes were seeing. It was not instant. It took approximately 4 seconds, I know, because I counted for the pieces to connect. His wife. In this building. At this table. In this context. His expression moved through a sequence I had imagined but could not have fully prepared for. Recognition, confusion, a flash of something almost like relief before he remembered where he was and what a boardroom meant, and then the slow, terrible understanding. "Claire," he said. "My name?" "Nothing else." "Hello," I said. "What are you? How are you?" He looked at Gerald. "I don't understand why she's here." Gerald folded his hands on the table. "Miss Hartwell is here in her capacity as the majority shareholder and founding principal of Hartwell Distribution Group. She is the ultimate beneficial owner of the parent entity that acquired Meridian Sales Group." The regional director made a sound that wasn't quite a word. My husband stared at me. "That's not," he stopped. Started again. "You work for Hartwell?" "I own Hartwell," I said. "I built it before I met you. I kept it private for reasons that seemed important at the time." He was quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't calm but is instead the stillness of a person trying very hard to assemble something that won't fit together. I don't, he started. You've been mocking your majority shareholder at dinner parties for 3 years, I said, and my voice was steady. You told your colleagues I was eternally unemployed. You told your mother I had never found my footing. You let your team believe the only reason you had a house like ours was because you were successful. I paused. All of that is its own conversation. Today's conversation is different. Monica clicked to the first slide of the compliance presentation. My husband's face changed when he saw it. His regional director went absolutely still. The other 3 members of the team began the involuntary reassessment of their posture that happens when people realize they've walked into something they cannot walk back out of. Over the past 18 months, Monica said, our compliance team conducted a detailed review of transaction patterns in Meridian's regional sales portfolio. What we found was a systematic arrangement in which hospital procurement managers received personal payments routed through false consulting invoices in exchange for preferential contract placement. She clicked through the slides. Transaction records, email chains, the 2 whistleblower accounts, the forensic accounting summary with its clear, unambiguous numbers. My husband did not look at me while this was happening. He looked at the screen, then at his hands, then at the regional director who was looking straight ahead with the fixed expression of a man trying to decide whether the situation was survivable. When the presentation ended, Gerald looked at my husband directly. Mr. Bradford, are you prepared to respond to these findings? My husband's lawyer, who had been reached an hour earlier and told to come immediately, was not yet in the building. My husband knew this. He looked at me, finally, and I saw something I had not expected. Not anger, but a kind of stripped confusion. The look of a person who has been running a particular story in their mind for years and has just been shown that the story was never true. You let me believe, he started. I let you show me who you were, I said. You did that without any help from me. He was quiet. The federal referral goes forward today regardless, I said. But you have a choice about how the next part of this proceeds. Full cooperation with investigators, complete disclosure of every transaction chain, and a detailed accounting of every person involved. That path has a different outcome than the path where you bring in lawyers and spend the next 2 years disputing documentation that is already in federal hands. The regional director spoke for the first time since entering the room. What kind of outcome are we talking about? Cooperation is noted in federal proceedings, I said simply. Non-cooperation is also noted. Gerald asked the room to give the Meridian team 15 minutes with their arriving counsel. Monica and I stepped into the corridor. Through the glass, I watched my husband sit motionless while his colleagues spoke in low, urgent voices around him. Monica stood beside me. How are you feeling? I'll let you know in an hour, I said. She nodded. Then, after a moment, they'll ask why you waited so long. The optics of not acting immediately. I acted the moment I had enough to make it count, I said. If I'd fired them 18 months ago with incomplete documentation, they'd have been hired somewhere else within 6 weeks and running the same scheme in a different region. Now they can't. The federal referral ensures that. She was quiet. There are 7 procurement managers at 3 hospital systems who've been paying into this arrangement because they were afraid of losing supply contracts, I said. Those people deserve more than severance packages and NDAs. They deserve to see this go somewhere real. The 15 minutes passed. We returned to the room. My husband's lawyer had arrived, a calm, practical woman who had clearly assessed the documentation on the way up the elevator and understood that the available moves were limited. She spoke briefly with Gerald, then she turned to her client. Full cooperation, she said to him. Today. My husband looked at me one more time. Whatever he was looking for, I don't think he found it. He signed the cooperation agreement at 11:20 that morning. His colleagues signed within the following half hour, each in a separate room, each beginning the process of providing names and transaction details that would ultimately expand the investigation to include 7 additional individuals across 4 other companies. I signed the documents authorizing the federal referral just before noon. The rest of that day was operational. Security teams, access revocations, legal notifications to the hospital systems involved, a carefully worded communication to Meridian's broader employee base that referenced organizational changes without providing details that could compromise the ongoing investigation. Monica brought me coffee at 2 o'clock and sat across from me. His things are being packed from his office, she said. He asked if you were available to speak. Not today, I said. Have legal send him the separation documents. The forensic accountants are reviewing his compensation history against the flagged transaction dates. Anything he received during periods of documented misconduct will be subject to recovery. She nodded. The two junior account managers who filed internal harassment reports last year, the ones his regional director buried? Fast-track their cases through HR, I said. If they want their positions back with restored seniority, that's the company's offer. If they've moved on and want compensation, we start those conversations immediately. I stood at the window for a while after Monica left, watching the afternoon traffic below. Somewhere across the city, my husband was probably sitting in his lawyer's office beginning to understand the full architecture of what had existed around him without his knowing. The house we'd shared, purchased with funds he'd never traced to their source. The car he drove, leased through a subsidiary he'd never connected to me. The professional world he'd navigated for 3 years while standing, without knowing it, on ground I owned. I thought about the fundraiser where we'd met. The early months when he'd been genuinely warm and curious and I'd let myself believe I'd found something real. I thought about the exact dinner party, 14 months into our marriage, when I first heard him describe me as a professional disappointment to someone who hadn't asked. The way he'd looked briefly in my direction afterward, checking, and then away, satisfied by my silence. My silence had never been what he thought it was. The federal investigation that followed took 11 months to complete. 3 of the 5 Meridian team members entered plea agreements. My husband and his regional director, on the advice of their separate counsel, provided extensive cooperation in exchange for prosecutorial considerations that kept them out of federal prison but included substantial fines, mandatory restitution payments, and a permanent bar from working in pharmaceutical distribution or any federally regulated industry. My husband lost the house, my house, in the divorce settlement that Monica's legal team had been quietly preparing since the compliance investigation began. The prenuptial agreement he'd waived 3 years into our marriage, dismissing it as unnecessary paperwork between people who trust each other, had been replaced with a postnuptial agreement his own attorney had reviewed and signed off on without understanding the full scope of the assets it protected. He relocated to a city 3 states away. I heard from Monica, 6 months after the divorce finalized, that he was working in regional sales for a small consumer goods company, a company that existed nowhere near any of mine. The 2 junior account managers who'd filed the buried harassment reports both returned to Meridian. One of them now leads the regional compliance program I built in the wake of the investigation. She is rigorous and fair and completely intolerant of the cultural patterns that had allowed her original reports to disappear. I've seen her work. She's excellent. The hospital procurement managers who participated in the scheme received their own federal scrutiny, though the cooperation agreements several of them had signed translated into reduced charges for those who had been coerced or pressured into participation. For those who'd initiated or significantly profited, the outcomes were harsher. Either way, the supply contracts that had been steered through preferential arrangements were restructured through a competitive bidding process that my team spent 6 months designing. There's a question I've been asked more than once since this became part of my professional story. Was it worth it? I think people expect a complicated answer. Something about the personal cost, the years of patience, the grief of having loved someone who turned out to be a different kind of person than I believed. What I actually feel is something simpler and, I think, more honest. I think about the junior account manager who runs the compliance program now. I think about the 7 procurement managers who were caught in an arrangement they hadn't designed but hadn't found a way out of. I think about the people who applied for positions at Meridian during those years and were overlooked because the team doing the hiring was self-selecting for people who would look away at the right moments. If I had moved the moment I discovered my husband was involved, I would have protected myself. I would have fired a few people, settled some internal claims, and published a press release about commitment to ethical business practices. And the regional director would have taken his scheme to his next employer within the year. Instead, I waited long enough to make the whole structure visible, long enough to document every connection, long enough to hand federal investigators a case they could actually prosecute. That took time. It cost me something personally that I won't pretend didn't matter. But the compliance program exists now. The hospital contracts are clean. The people who were harassed and sidelined have been made whole. As much as a company can make someone whole. That's what remains after you decide to do this right instead of just doing it fast, not the satisfaction of a single dramatic moment, though there was one of those too. Something more durable, something that actually changes things. My name is on the door now. After 12 years of operating through holding companies and legal structures, I made a deliberate decision, 2 months after the investigation concluded, to remove the anonymity. The building directory reads Hartwell Distribution Group, and on the executive floor, the door to my office reads simply, Claire Hartwell, founder. No more useful invisibility. No more quiet observation from a distance. I have a company to run, and it's time everyone knew whose company it is.